Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the webinar today, 5 Ways to Increase Market Share and Profitability for Collection Law Firms and Agencies Through Technology. My name is Ann Danhausen. I manage business development and strategic alliances at Provana, and I will be your moderator for today. Before I introduce our panelists, just wanted to cover a little bit of housekeeping. Basically, you will be muted throughout the webinar today, but if you do have questions, there is a Q&A tab on your toolbar there at the bottom for Zoom. So go ahead and put a question in there, and we are going to handle questions at the end. All right, so I'm really excited to be joined today by our 2 speakers, John Bedard and Sean Clark. We'll provide a little bit of bios for you. John Bedard is the managing attorney of Bedard Law Group PC, located in Atlanta, Georgia. He represents creditors, asset buyers, and debt collectors, helping them stay in compliance with state and federal law. He also manages the nationwide litigation for several collection agencies and focuses his litigation practice on FDCPA, TCPA, and FCRA defense. John's practice also focuses on defending regulatory actions, including CFPB investigations, and travels the country performing CFPB readiness assessments for the collection industry. He received his law degree from the Syracuse University College of Law and his undergraduate degree in economics from the Pennsylvania State University. Sean Clark is the Vice President of Platforms at Provana LLC. With 16 years of experience in the collection industry, Sean guides the development of compliance, analytics, and consumer experience platforms across several market verticals. He received his Master's of Business Administration from the Pena School at the University of Scranton, specialization in Enterprise Resource Planning, summa cum laude. So thanks for joining us, guys. Yeah, so just a little bit of context here. Our focus today is really to understand how we can leverage technology to increase market share, and we really think there's opportunity for that. The state of technology today within this industry, you can see a couple of stats on the screen here. $11 billion is the 2019 revenue of debt collection agencies. So our thought is, how can we make sure that, as the industry is growing, you're getting the big enough slice of pie as you can. And then as you can see, 35% companies using a compliance software, 17% using speech analytics. So still opportunity for some growth and other technologies, or more growth within these areas for industry participants. We also found that 71% of collection organizations admit that business growth is a huge challenge in the current market. So most of our clients that we talk to are focused on how do they scale. Scalability seems to be a challenge. Hiring is difficult with today's low unemployment rate, so there are challenges to growing as quickly as you'd like. And of course, we believe that technology can be part of the answer to help you scale and grow. So how do you ensure that your business is profitable, productive, and growth-oriented? And with that question, I'm gonna hand it over to Sean and John to dive in here.
Well, thanks, Ann. And based on where you are in the world, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. This is Sean Clark, Vice President of Platforms at Provana. And so as John and I talked and prepared for this webinar, we were really trying to think about different ways for that we could advise, say, how do you really effectively leverage technology for sustainable growth, right? And to Ann's point, as the industry is in a growth phase right now, how do you really increase your market share? So the 2 perspectives that we took was to say, well, number 1, you should be able to gain new market share by increasing performance and leveraging technology to identify ways to sustainably increase performance and bring your agents and staff up to speed. The other perspective is, how do you keep and protect that market share by building scalable and compliant processes right from the ground up? So in other words, not bolting on compliance later, but really understanding how do you grow and scale your company, leveraging technology, utilizing best practices in compliance. So the way John and I thought that we would kind of conquer and divide would be to say that John is going to focus on a few key principles, by no means comprehensive, not enough time in the day, but a few key principles of how to build sustainably and scalably a compliant organization. And I'm going to look at a few key measures where companies can define a set of reasonable goals for everybody to follow, how you define those goals, and then how you refine and enhance those goals by using coaching, tracking, and paying attention to core KPIs. So with that kind of as the context, right? So understanding an industry and growth and a few key ideas on how we can leverage performance and compliance to gain and protect that market share, I'd love to hand off on the next slide over to John to start talking about these key principles of building a compliance shop.
Sean, thank you very much. Can you hear me okay?
Sounds great, John.
Yes.
Excellent, thank you. And so let me begin by thanking you, Ann, and thanking you, Sean, and thanking your Provana team for inviting me to participate today. I am delighted to be here with you today, and it's a real honor for me to have been invited by Provana because you guys are, you have your finger on the pulse of all this, and to be invited to join you is just a real honor, so thank you. The first thing that I'd like to talk about is effective document control. And when it comes to, Sean, talking about the kind of scalability that you were talking about, understanding the kind of increases in volume that the industry is experiencing in terms of inbound communication, outbound communication, managing all of that documentation is something that I think the industry can really utilize technology in order to reduce cost, increase efficiency, and be able to scale the way you were just describing about scaling businesses, and the result of which would be sort of the gaining in market share that you were talking about. And so what does that really mean, effective document control? Well, when we talk about some of the things that documents and document control it need to be the focus of a compliance management system, you know, processing documents, reducing all this indexing time, establishing workflows for document management, the ease in which we can store and retrieve documents and the systems that we use to do that, all of those things contribute to higher efficiency, lower cost management of documents and document control. When it comes to the actual content and controlling of documents themselves, there's really a whole lot for us to consider how technology can really make that process more efficient. One of the things that we tell clients all the time about the documents that they produce, whether it be collection letters, whether it be policies and procedures, whether it be audit reports, or wherever it is that their workflow causes them to create materials or create documents, establishing adequate version control on those documents is something that we encourage clients to do. Is it possible for your company to go backwards in time 6 months and identify the state of the document as it existed 6 months ago, or a year ago, or 3 years ago, especially when it comes to the policies and procedures that a company has, the authorization for those policies and procedures, and how companies control change management on those documents. So we talk about version control, we talk about authorization control. Who has the authorization to view the document, to edit the document, to share the document? All of those things go into an effective document control program. When we're talking about access control, it is so very important to make sure that the appropriate people have access to the documents that your company creates, and that the people who are not appropriate to have access to them don't. And there's no better way to keep those controls in place and to manage them in a way that lets the company scale those workflows than to be utilizing technology to be handling all of that management. We talk about change management as well. Who has authority to change a document, to view a document, to share documents? Technology is really the key to managing that in a way that is very, very cost effective and provides wide and deep control on a scalable level to companies that utilize technology tools to do that. Finally, the last point that we want to share here with respect to document control is the implementation of uniform security protocols. And that has to do with access control, that has to do with sharing control, it has to do with the content itself. And so technology and the tools that are available in the marketplace today to make sure that companies have all of those ingredients for an effective document control policy in place, they can find those solutions in technologies that help them manage those documents and scale their workflows when it comes to documents in ways that can achieve the market share that is the focus of this presentation today.
Oh, that's great. So, John, I think I'll pick up the baton here. Anne, if you can shift over to the next slide there. So the way I kind of look at this in my own mind is to say that John is teaching us how to properly wear our seatbelts and drive safely. And I'm focusing here on how we really push our foot down on the gas and continue to build performance. So you need both,
great analogy.
right, John?
Yes, yes. And, Sean, what's funny is sometimes clients perceive my role as telling them to take the foot off the gas. And that's not always true, because the way we approach these things is to be telling clients, look, if you're going to keep the foot down, let's make sure we have some airbags, right? Let's make sure we're putting our seatbelts on. Let's make sure we understand we can see the road clearly, right? Because all of those things help to protect against risk. And so it's not about taking your foot off the gas. It's about keeping the pedal down and making sure we're doing it right. I love the analogy.
Yeah. No, absolutely agreed, John. And that's why I didn't say that your part is putting on the brake and mine is the gas, because I don't believe that. So yeah, and as I take a look at other ways to keep that foot on the gas, I kind of threw a dart at the dartboard and said, let's look at an agent perspective here, right? So I would argue that what I'm talking about here in this section is equally applicable to everybody in your office. If you're running a collection law firm, this applies to your attorneys, to your legal staff, to your agents, to your GARN team, all the way up and down the channels. If you're running an agency, this applies to everybody in your office. And what are they accountable for, right? So, the key principle that I want to talk about here in this slide is to say, how are you using technology to establish clear goals, to have agreed upon KPIs, right? Let's have an understood SLA or a KPI where we say, this is about what should be expected of somebody in this process. And how do we create accountability around that, right? It's methods for tracking and accountability that say, if I'm responsible for this, I need the tools to be able to manage to it. So one of the key ideas here is that, do you have the technology solution in place where each layer of your team has, in a tiered way, access to the right data? So what do I mean there? I mean that the executive team, the management team, the shareholders, right? These are folks who need to be able to see at a high level what's happening in your company. They need to be able to track to overall goals of the company. Your managers and your supervisors, they need a layer of access that say, well, I have 5 or 10 or 15 people who report to me, and I'm ultimately accountable for their output, right? How am I effectively tracking that more often than monthly or weekly, right? To understand, where they are in terms of their goals. And all the way down to the individual agent or staff member, right? You are individually accountable and perhaps incentivized to these goals, right? So how are you staying on track? So the way I look at it is, that you need a system that allows you to create your baseline. Start with a baseline to say, how do I even understand where I am today? How am I performing today before I've taken steps to change or improve my processes? So from that baseline, you can start to track now to say, how effective on an iterative basis are my improvements, right? I saw a problem in this key area, and now I'm creating changes, right? Whether it's a change in process, a change in training, a change in staff. How are you creating a method to say, well, I need to now compare my results today with where I was against my baseline? And then to be able to correlate those two things to say, well, here's where I was, here's where I am today, but where should I be, right? What's the right number here? What's the right goal? So some of the things that we look at, I said I would do this from kind of an agent, a call center agent basis, is to say, let's at least understand what are the components that are within your control and not within your control, and give you the method to track those things. So for example, if you are an agent who's participant in an outbound campaign, one of the things that's within your control is the total number of attempts, right? How many swings at the plate are you taking? This is something where you can be directly accountable for your own productivity, how you're working your system, how you're working your phone. That's something you're accountable for. You should have a system that's being able to track your personal productivity. And then once we take that universe, right, that's the top of the waterfall is all your attempts. How about connections, right? Connections, it's not necessarily within your control as an agent, but as a company, you start to understand connects as a measure of how effectively you're building your campaigns, what tools you're using, your skip tools, right? So you can track to the effectiveness and efficiency of your campaigns by tracking connects and even right party contacts. A right party contact is not within your agent's control. You don't know who they're talking to initially, but the tools that you're using to get the right people on the phone are within your control as a firm or an agency and not within the agent's control. But now that you got the right person on the phone, now that comes back to the agent's control, right? So how are you effectively tracking what they're doing about the total number of connects they're trying to make? What are they doing when they have the right RPC, when they have the right person on the phone? And then how effectively are you converting that to a successful outcome? So the tools that you need to have in place are understanding at this really granular level, these, again, just from the agent perspective, these daily collection reports. And I know that's probably a blocking and tackling report for many people, but how well are you getting that data down to your managers, down to your agents on a daily basis, even a near to real time basis, right? To say, here's where you are in progress to your goal. Why is this your goal? Because this was our baseline. Here are the manageable and measurable things we've done to change it. Here's where you are today. And here are our internal expectations based on that. Here are our client expectations. And I need to give you a clear insight as to whether you're on track or off track. So where I see this then as, I'll jump ahead, in the next piece that I'm going to talk about is to say, now how, once you've identified these clear goals and these clear KPIs, how do you actually measurably affect change and improve the output of, in this case, your agents? So that's a little bit more of the gas pedal talk. I'd love to pass the baton right back to you, John, talk about the next aspect of compliance.
Yes, and before we talk about effective compliance, Sean, let me ask you a question. Are you seeing companies in the industry now beginning to create KPIs around compliance as well?
That is a great question. I would say that from what I see, firms and agencies by this point in the industry, if you're still open, you've got the essentials figured out, right? That you've at least got some basic processes in place, some idea on what you need to track. But in terms of actual KPIs, how effectively should they be handling complaints or disputes or turnaround times? I don't know if that's really widespread yet, John.
Yeah, and the reason I ask is because I think this is slowly trickling into the psyche and to the processes of compliance management systems, is to really begin to not only have production KPIs, but also the compliance KPIs as well. How do we handle complaints? How do we handle disputes? Are they effective? What are our goals for response times? What are our, all of those kind of things. And so I'm beginning to see that more and more. And I'm beginning to see more and more enhancements to technology in the marketplace that allow agencies and people in the arms space to really begin to measure that as well. Because if we're not measuring it, well, then we're not able to do really any analysis that'll allow us to make good decisions about what it is that we're doing and how we're doing it. And that brings us, Sean, to the next thing that we'll talk about here is effective complaint management and how technology can help companies really manage their complaints. And I want to begin by distinguishing my sense of the difference between a dispute and a complaint, so that what we all understand we're talking about here is really complaints for the moment. Most of what we're going to talk about can apply equally to disputes, but nonetheless, when it comes to technology and complaint management, there's a lot available out there in terms of tools. A dispute is something that a consumer will say or do that will indicate their unbelief or understanding that the money is not owed, that the debt is not due for some reason or another. Either it's been paid, either it's the wrong amount, either I'm not the right person to be asking, whatever it is. A dispute focuses on the obligation itself for the consumer to pay the account. When I'm talking about complaints, however, what I mean is the consumer has a problem with the behavior of the agent or the behavior of the collection agency. And so not necessarily focused on the debt itself, but it's the behavior itself. And we get those, we get complaints. Hey, look, stop calling me at work. I told you not to call me at all. I only wanted to be communicated with in writing. I don't like how I was treated on the last call, on and on, right? Those are kind of complaints. And the real question is, how is a company capturing all of those complaints? And let me give you for example, Sean. Some of the things that I see very often when we're doing on-site compliance auditing is we will learn that if a consumer has a complaint about the company, but that the agent handles that complaint so well on the telephone that that complaint ends up getting resolved to the consumer's satisfaction on that phone because the agent did so well, that complaint never hits the radar of the compliance management system. And so the company really doesn't know that a complaint came in and it was resolved. It just doesn't ever get into the data structure to say, oh, we had a problem, but we fixed it. And so monitoring the channels through which complaints can come in, like through website, through email, phone, you name it, monitoring to make sure that you're capturing all complaints that come in, including complaints that agents hear on the telephone from consumers that may even be resolved on the telephone. And there's lots of technology out there that the industry can be using to make sure they're capturing all those complaints, not the least of which is speech analytics. And I know you, Sean and Pravana, are experts at this speech analytics stuff. And I presume that one of the things that you do for your clients is to be able to identify those kind of complaints and make sure agents have coded those accounts correctly, that there's been a complaint and that the complaint has or has not been resolved. Speech analytics can serve many, many different functions, not the least of which is making sure that the company does not miss or avoid capturing complaints that consumers might have on the telephone. The other very important thing when it comes to effective complaint management is capturing all of them and then aggregating that data. What are we doing with this complaint data, and what can we learn about the way our company is behaving or the way our own clients are behaving based upon the information we're learning through the aggregated complaint data. Are we trending? Are we trending by client? Are we trending by product line? Are we trending by behavior, by company behavior? Do we have telephone complaints? Do we have letter complaints? What's happening? And so when it comes to complaint management, the two biggest things that we tell clients all the time, Sean, is make sure you have systems in place to capture all of the complaints that consumers have about your company. And number two, make sure that you are aggregating that data so that the company can take action on the information that the analysis of that trending tells the company. Of course, we're going to respond to consumer complaints. Of course, certain complaints are going to be escalated, and so all of those things are ingredients of a mature compliance management system, and we're beginning to see technology really infiltrate this area to provide really great solutions to companies who need effective complaint management.
Yeah, and John, I want to kind of pick up on that point and really ask you, how much are you seeing that, that companies are effectively, well, whether or not they're effectively doing it, are companies thinking about this, right? Because the way I look at it, and it might actually be a pretty effective segue into the part that I wanted to cover next in terms of coaching, which is to say, yeah, through tools like speech, you should be able to find the entire spectrum, right? You should be able to find the entire universe of those complaints. And then having found them, you should be able to, number one, correlate that with your transaction system to make sure that they're getting appropriately noted, that a workflow is happening because of it, that the complaints themselves are being captured in a complaint management system, right? And that, to your last point, that aggregation and trending that says, what is it, either through policy or procedure or training, that I can do to actually move that needle, right? Where are those complaints coming from? And is it something that, is it in our new scripting? Is it something, that new IVR we just put in, is that creating hold time complaints? Is it, what are those root causes? And I guess the question to you, John, is how much do you see this as, even being on people's radar? And, if it's on their radar, how effectively are companies controlling for it?
Yes, and so the top, if we were to sort of segment the marketplace into sort of size and sophistication of companies, almost 100% of the very largest companies in the industry have super sophisticated complaint management systems to analyze data, to capture everything. You name it, it's very, very sophisticated. But we are also seeing now a very significant growth in companies seeking out and implementing complaint management systems, even at the other end of the size and sophistication spectrum in the marketplace. And so, companies with as few as 10, 15, 20 employees are really becoming keen on managing complaints, making sure they're responding to them, making sure that they are capturing them, and then making sure that they are beginning to learn from the data that is they are creating when they gather all of these complaints up and aggregate the data. We are seeing it more and more. The biggest gap that we see when it comes to companies and their complaint management systems is that they're not effectively capturing all of the complaints, so that when a complaint comes in through the website, it doesn't hit the system. It might get sent to a manager on the floor, it might get sent to somebody in compliance to handle, but it doesn't actually make it into the system. Or something comes in through email. Not all of them actually get into the system. Most of the time what we see is complaints not hitting the system when the company thinks they have been immediately addressed, especially on the telephone. The complaint that becomes resolved in a single telephone call never hits the system at all. And so
Yeah.
when our agents behave perfectly, exactly how they've been trained, they may very well be avoiding the very thing that we want our system to capture, which is to be logging all the complaints in, but at the same time logging in the resolutions as well. And so that's what we see a lot, is that complaints don't get captured. But the degree of sophistication with respect to how they capture, how they analyze, how they do all that, it varies widely based upon what we see when we're on site doing compliance audits and sort of CFPP mock exams.
So as a key best practice takeaway to ensure that all of those different channels through which a complaint could flow are, number one, being effectively and immediately captured, right? Number two, kind of correlated against the transaction system to make sure that there's no disconnect between what's getting captured in the complaint and how it's being acted upon. Number three, which is to be able to identify trends in what is being, what the complaints are about, where they're coming from, and how they're aggregated. And then four, being able to, turn that into an effective remediation path, be it through training or policy or procedure review, things that really kind of effectively prevent those things from happening in the first place.
You just said it about 10 times better than I just said it. Absolutely. Yep.
We're passing the baton back and forth. That's all.
Yeah. All right. Tell us about, coaching collection floors and agents, and tell us about that.
Yeah, I think this is it's really a great segue because when I look at effective coaching for the collection floor, I tend to look at it and really just kind of break it down into 3 Ps, right? So it's policy, performance, and productivity. And I think a big part of policy is what we've started to talk about here, John, where I think about policy not only as, script adherence and disclosures and mini Miranda, but just risk mitigation in general, right? What are those things that you're doing in the call that reduce your chances of creating a situation that ends up in a complaint, right? These are encapsulated under policy. How effectively are you verifying that consumer in the RPC, right? How effectively are you handling escalations or, calls that start to go a little bit sideways, complaint handling, preventing a call from getting, flagged as a compliance, question, for one reason or another. So I think all of these things really roll up very effectively under the policy and adherence aspect of coaching. And, to your point earlier, John, kind of how are you capturing the full extent, the full universe of calls that need coaching? And there are a lot of tools out there, certainly speech analytics being one of them, side-by-side coaching be another, statistical sampling based on listed call codes and disposition codes in your system, right? Identifying those calls that are most likely to have an issue, getting into them, listening to them, and then calibrating with the agent. The other 2 buckets, I really want to spend a little bit of time on here, productivity, right? So productivity is one thing that is really very much within the agent's control if they have effective training. And some of the things that we've found in our own review, where we either apply speech analytics or that statistical sampling that I mentioned, we find actually that these roll up to a few really definable root causes as to why some agents are far more productive than others. So I wanted to share a couple of those, 3 of the most prevalent root causes that we find in this area. So root cause number 1 of lower productivity is inability or ineffectiveness at navigating their own transaction system. All right, so this is a pure training issue, right? Call comes in, hey, this is Sean Clark. Hang on a second, let me look you up in my system. Bear with me, hang on, still haven't found you, right? I mean, training things that are easily addressed by saying, listen, here's a more effective way of using my system to find this consumer very rapidly. Phone number, name, other ways of finding you in the system. This is training, but how do you know? How do you know going into it, which of your agents are the worst at using your system? right? And except if you randomly find it or happen to be sitting next to an agent while they're still, still have a consumer on hold, how do you find this? So being able to find the total spectrum of agents who are just worse at using the system than others, that's a massive win in terms of productivity, because the faster you can find the consumer, the faster you can wrap up that call and make or take your next one. One of the other things that we see as really a root cause of less productivity is an excessive reliance on the second voice or kicking it up to a supervisor. This is something that you may already have some kind of anecdotal evidence for in your organization, right? You might have some supervisors or some more experienced and tenured agents complaining, hey, this guy's always kicking a call to me for a second voice. But how do you really effectively root out those agents who are always relying on the second voice, who are not self-handling that call or being trained to handle that call in more situations? So we find that to be another really effective way to move the needle in training agents more effectively on how to close that call themselves, rather than hold time, let me transfer you, let me find somebody else who can help you. And the interesting and fairly common one that we find is, for lack of a better term, kind of sandbagging the call, right? Excessive wrap-up time is the technical term. Letting a voicemail go an extra 30 or 45 or 60 seconds, waiting in between calls while they're handling their notes. And this again comes down to a training and coaching issue, right? How are you, the agent, being trained to contemporaneously be taking those notes, to be applying those disposition codes, to be doing what you need to do in the file while you're in the file and on the phone, as opposed to taking that extra 30 seconds or a minute and a half to do the wrap up? So we find that as another really very common finding that we have, and a really easy way in terms of coaching to say, listen, here's how you work on those notes while you're on the call. Here are some tips and tricks from the most tenured collectors and the most tenured agents on how you more effectively use your system. And that also rolls, oh, go ahead, John. Yeah.
I'm sorry, let me interrupt there. I can't emphasize how awesome that is that you just talked about that, because of the thousands and thousands of pages of policies and procedures that we have read here in our office when clients need help, we have never once seen what you just described there in those 3 items. And that really makes a difference. It really does make a difference. It makes a difference in terms of compliance and contemporaneous nature with creating notes and things like that. It makes a difference on efficiency. It really, I don't see clients typically looking at that data, and I don't see clients training that way. But I think it's fantastic that the folks get to hear everything you've just said about that, because those things make a difference.
Well, I appreciate that, John, and we see this as having impact in organizations of really vastly disparate sizes. So all the way down to floors that only have maybe 5 or 6 agents, and a supervisor says, you know what, I'm on the floor, right? I hear what's going on. And you do, but you also have your own day job, right? So there's a lot of stuff that you're just not able to pay attention to, even with a floor of only 5 or 50 or 500, right? We're finding these trends and saying, you know what, floor wide, here are the specific areas where I can apply effort that's going to move the needle, and then be able to shift that down and say, having addressed where I see the biggest opportunity as an agency or a firm, how am I creating those tools to say, and break it down to the team level, right? Because maybe teams are acting or performing in different ways, and having broken it down to the team level, how am I getting that insight right down to the agent, who from self-coaching perspective, from even a gamification perspective, and can see, listen, here's how I compare with my peers, right? Here's where I am over or underperforming my peers in these key areas. And by the way, these key areas speak directly to what I'm accountable for and incentivized for, right? So I have every reason in the world to get better in these areas, to make or take more calls, to be more effective in my performance and how I handle the right party contact, how I reduce my risk of creating a complaint situation, or how I learn to de-escalate a situation. These things speak directly to what I'm incentivized for and what I'm accountable for. So, the key takeaway for me is, how are you using technology to bring these key principles down to the agent level, giving your managers the tools to to manage these small teams, and then up to the executive level and say, what are the most impactful things that I can be doing as a firm or an agency that's going to move the needle for everybody?
Absolutely. And it is not lost on me, and I know it won't be on everybody listening, of the very important thing you mentioned right there, which is the incentivization, how we incentivize agents. We get the behavior that we incentivize. And if we want efficient behavior, if we want compliant behavior, then we have to make sure that the incentives that the company creates are aligned with those goals. We often find that the incentive programs are created by people who are independent of the responsibility of production efficiency, like you're talking about, and also independent of the people responsible for the compliance function of the company. And so we always encourage clients to bring that piece of the puzzle, which is a very important piece, the incentivization, and bring it into the fold when it comes to talking about how we're coaching, when it comes to talk about what we are incentivizing agents to do or employees to do, and how we want them to behave, so that both the compliance function of the company, the production portion of the company, are all incentivized to row in the same direction. That makes a very big difference, and we have seen tremendous results in companies reaching the goals that they set for themselves when they take a look again, a second look at how they incentivize agent behavior.
No, I think that's a great point, John. And in fact, if right now, if this was a collection call, I would actually also say that was a great bridging statement to your next slide in talking about compliance training.
Very good. So let's talk about that. Compliance training is a necessary ingredient to a mature compliance management system. You don't have a mature compliance management system unless you have compliance training processes in place. Training is hard. We have to manage the material and the content of that training program. We have to manage what we referred to earlier as change management. How do we make sure that our training materials are updated to reflect the most current state of the law that seems to be in flux all the time? How are we using technology to deliver training content to our employees, to our floor, to our staff? How are we logging and tracking attendance at training sessions or training functions? One of the things that we look for when we're auditing clients for compliance is whether or not they have role-specific training. The real mature compliance management systems actually measure, monitor, and control role-specific training. And so, the training that the board of directors receives is different than the training that the frontline collector receives. And tailoring training programs to the different and specific roles in the company is really what separates the mature training programs from, sort of your average training programs. And then managing that process. How do we use technology to manage all of the moving parts that surround a mature compliance training program? And there are lots of tools out there to do it. And Sean, I have sort of generically referred to these technology tools as learning management systems. Sure. And how do they effectively help companies control their content, even create content? There's lots of management systems out there that actually have content, sort of off-the-shelf content. How do we manage training it? And not the least of which is to be very sensitive to client requirements and client requests. And so not only are we training to the law, but we are training for production metrics, and we're also training to client requirements. And we can use technology to make sure that everybody gets the same training for their specific role, the way the company needs them to be trained. Lots of customization tools are available out there. In terms of having your policies and procedures to document the kind of training program that the company requires, that's something else that these learning management systems can help companies create and maintain. And so the compliance training function of a company is a very important ingredient to the company's overall compliance management system. And there are some very effective technology tools out there that will allow companies to manage content, to deliver content, to measure the results and the effectiveness of all of that training content, and of course, to log attendance and track performance of everybody who is engaging and taking all of this training. I mean, there are some really some systems out there that have tools that will remind agents of their responsibilities to go through training, and not surprisingly, their compliance KPIs, their compliance obligations, alert payroll department on wait a minute, these incentives are no longer eligible because the agent didn't complete all of their training that they're supposed to take. There are some good reminder tools out there on how different agents are at different progress points throughout a training program at a company. And so when we talk about preparing adequate training resources and setting standardized compliance and auditing procedures, there's lots of technology out there that would really help companies reduce cost, increase effectiveness, and it's hard to measure, but Sean, I tell clients that the benefits of all of that effort, although may be intangible and difficult to measure at different points in the production process, have an overall effect that more than outweighs the cost of going through this process.
Yeah, I completely agreed, John. And really, to kind of capture some of your earlier points too, it's number one, an effective tool like the one that you're describing is also one that would let you aggregate those results and understand, where are the people in my company struggling, right? Are there particular tests or concepts or items that I'm seeing consistent failure or miss rates across the company? Are there areas where I can really hone in my own training program, right, to say that this is something that's clearly hurting, and they're not understanding it or they're not getting the concept, and then being able to demonstrate to external stakeholders like clients or even regulatory bodies, look at the results of my program, right? We've put together a comprehensive program that covers the points that we need. We aggregate those results to understand how people are performing, and we can demonstrate that systemic and, kind of to the core point here, that sustainable and scalable compliance by tracking it within the system and not doing it manually.
Absolutely. Absolutely right. And by doing all of that, we can identify trends in client behavior. We can identify trends in the quality of our own training program. Why is it that we're getting so many complaints from consumers who are in the military? Well, let's go back to our training. Do we have effective training when it comes to, the Service Members Civil Relief Act? Why are we getting so many complaints in this particular area? Or why are consumers calling in to ask the very same question about this client's, portfolio that we're collecting for them? And so, that's an example of a client-specific training element there. And so taking that data, aggregating it into sort of something that can create actionable results is really going to separate the mature training systems from, sort of your run-of-the-mill training system.
Definitely, definitely. So I think, Anne, I may hand back to you. I think John and I have really hopefully scoped out the corners of our of our pieces here.
Yeah, absolutely. Just run through some key takeaways here in regards to the types of technology that can really help you increase market share. So we talked about, of course, effective document control, providing daily feedback for agents and associates, having an effective complaint management system and process, coaching collection for agents, and training for compliance adherence. So we're wrapping up. We're getting towards the end of the call here, everyone, but we wanted to save some time for questions as well. So if you want to go ahead and type any questions into the question box there, we will address those momentarily. We also just highlighted on the screen here some of the technology platforms that Pravana provides to help in some of these different areas: compliance management, analytics, call analytics, as well as consumer self-service. And then John, I think you have some technology pieces that you bring to the table as well.
Well, one of the things that we do for clients is we offer this thing called BLG 360, which is really sort of a flat fee, all-you-can-eat compliance service that we offer to clients. And, you know, phone calls, emails, letter review, whatever it is that they need from a compliance perspective, we want to encourage them to pick up the phone and call us and not have to worry about getting billed by the hour, because that's the way a lot of lawyers charge people. And so it's sort of a one-stop compliance shop for you know, one low fee, and we've got lots of clients that are really taking advantage of that, and they're getting the compliance services that they need, the compliance advice they need. And so that's just one more thing that we add. And not coincidentally, is a very nice complement to all the technology services that you guys provide that we're seeing right here on the screen.
Yeah, I appreciate
Absolutely.
that, John. And I won't belabor any of the systems here, except to say that kind of the methodology and the mentality that you and I have been describing in this call, right? These are kind of components of a core philosophy about how you run a company. And I would just say about our platforms that that's how we build it in, right? We kind of build our philosophy into these platforms along these, what we think are the key best practices on how to run the shop. So I appreciate that handoff, John.
My pleasure, and I'm delighted to be involved in that with you guys, because it really creates a superior offering when it comes to serving the needs of the industry.
All right. Well, let me open up the questions here and see what's come through. I'm going to start with one that is talking about complaints. So how do you define a complaint?
So, Sean, I'll take that one. I define a consumer complaint as an expression by the consumer of dissatisfaction in the company's behavior, not focused on the debt, like I don't owe it, or it's not mine, or I paid it already, or it's the wrong balance. No, those are all what I call disputes, because it's an objection to the payment of the account. When I talk about complaints, what I really mean is the consumer's expression of dissatisfaction with the behavior of the company. Meaning, look, I told you yesterday not to call me at work, and here you are calling me again today. Or, look, I told you not to talk to my parents about this debt. It's my debt. Don't talk to my parents about it. Or stop calling my neighbors, or whatever that is. It's about the behavior of the company and not the debt itself. That's how I distinguish between complaints and disputes.
Great, thanks.
Yeah,
that's when we hear as well.
Yeah, that is far beyond my power to add or detract. I'll take that, John.
There's one question here about what tools are available to track version control of template letters as opposed to policies and procedures.
Go ahead, Sean.
Yeah, well, that's a great question. Certainly version control is something that is built in. Certainly, John, you referenced earlier kind of what separates a sophisticated overall platform from one that's less sophisticated. I would say more sophisticated policy and procedure management and compliance platforms would incorporate version control as a basic tenet. That as you change things, whether they be policy, procedure, or to your question, Anne, letter templates, where you should be able to say, go back to a certain point of time and show me the template as it existed at the time that, let's say, a complaint came in, or where we had a version change from a client or a statute update or change. So I think that is a fairly standard component of more sophisticated compliance management systems. I would also say that given the tools that most people have just at their fingertips, right, through tools like Microsoft Office and Office 365, there are version tracking and management tools within that system that you can take even tools that are very commonly available, introduce some element of version control as you get ready to transition to a more sophisticated platform that is managing it for you, that's keeping version history, along with who's making those changes, reason documentation to say, why was that change made? I think those would tend to be components of the more sophisticated system.
That's exactly what I've seen, Sean, too. And correct me if I'm wrong, I think your IPAC system does that, doesn't it?
It does.
Yeah.
We see that as a key component, just basic tenet of compliance for sure.
And so I've seen that operate on that system, and it operates exactly how you just described. And when it comes to the tools, I have seen clients use the same tool to manage version control with their policies and procedures as they do with their letters. And so I don't think I've ever seen a client use a different tool, because that tool is designed for version control no matter what the document is. And so it works just as well for letters as it does for policies and procedures, as it does for training materials and lots of other documents that the company manages. I've seen I've seen the real, I've seen the Ferrari of systems like your system and others, and then I've seen, what I call the Chevy Cavalier system, which works just fine for many people, right? And it's as simple as using some of those tools in Microsoft Word and those other editing software that, quite literally, there's just a table at the bottom of the document that says, here's the employee that made a change, here's the employee that authorized it, and here's a description of what the change was. And so we can get real sophisticated in terms of preventing somebody from actually changing a document to simply having a document there, but documenting all the changes that there are less sort of controls over. But the systems like yours, you can have viewing rights, you can have editing rights, you can have sharing rights. You can manage all kinds of different rights depending on the security group, I guess is the way to put it, that the user is assigned to. I hope that answers the question, Anne.
Yeah, no, I think that's good. And yeah, to your point, I've seen people use our policy and procedure management module in IPAC for their letters, or that similar sort of functionality.
Yeah.
So I think we are pretty much at the top of the hour here. If anyone has any other questions, you can still enter them, and we will get back to you individually. And we will also share a webinar recording with the group. Appreciate everyone's time. And Sean and John, thank you so much for joining us. And it's been a great webinar. Thank you.
My pleasure, and thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Anne.